So what happens when an entire nation decides to literally fire the divine? That's the core tension we're exploring today. Imagine a society going through a total governmental meltdown and deciding the only way out of their misery is to march right up to their invisible divine CEO and hand over a pink slip. Sounds completely radical, right? Well, that's exactly the problem-solution-consequence narrative that played out in ancient Israel, and it changed their history forever. To understand what they were abandoning, we have to look at how things worked before this massive shift. Israel wasn't just some chaotic, kingless territory. They operated under a strict theocracy. And by that, I mean a system where God is recognized directly as the ultimate king. They were uniquely governed by an invisible divine monarch. There was no royal palace. There was no human king sitting on a throne making up laws. The ultimate authority was heavenly, not earthly.
So how did they actually get anything done day to day? Well, Israel relied on what they called judges. Think of figures like Gideon, Samson, and Deborah. These were temporary, divinely appointed leaders. The system was highly decentralized. These judges only really rose to power during specific national crises to deliver the people, and then they stepped right back. Contrast that with the kings of the surrounding nations. Those were permanent, centralized human monarchs with absolute everyday power. The Israelites looked across their borders, saw all that permanent, stable power, and then looked back at their own crisis-driven, temporary leadership, and they started getting anxious.
The massive shift we're talking about didn't just happen out of nowhere. The drivers of this rebellion really boil down to three main categories: leadership, military, and cultural. Think of this just like you'd analyze a modern governmental collapse. You've got internal rot, you've got external threats, and you've got this deep underlying psychological shift happening within the population. Let's break down each of these three pillars. Reason number one was the immediate catalyst: totally corrupt leadership. At the time, the aging prophet and judge, Samuel, had appointed his two sons, Joel and Abijah, to take over. But they didn't exactly follow in their father's upright footsteps. In fact, they were notoriously corrupt. We're talking taking bribes, perverting justice, the whole 9 yards. So the elders of Israel weren't just complaining for no reason. They were actually being super pragmatic. They realized the current system was deeply unsustainable, and they flat out refused to let this corrupt lineage inherit power and drag the nation down. But hey, internal corruption was only half the problem. Reason number two was a massive ongoing military threat. Israel was under immense pressure from neighboring nations, especially the Philistines and the Ammonites, who were led by this terrifying guy named King Nahash. And here was the huge logistical nightmare of the judges' system. Israel had no standing army. If a crisis hit, a judge literally had to send out word and hope the tribes voluntarily rallied together. That took precious time. The Israelites were terrified. They wanted a permanent military commander, someone who would, as they put it, go out before us and fight our battles. They wanted a constant, unified defense force that was ready to deploy at a moment's notice.
And that brings us to reason number three, the real cultural core of their demand. They said, "Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." Now, what's really interesting about this specific quote is how it exposes a deep psychological insecurity. Israel felt weird. They felt awkward compared to their neighbors. Every other nation had these highly visible, powerful kings surrounded by all this impressive royal pageantry. Instead of embracing their unique identity as a people relying on an invisible king, the Israelites craved the tangible, visible security of a human monarch. Simply put, they just wanted to fit in.
Takes the people's demand straight to God. And God's response is incredibly stark. He says, "Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." I mean, wow. That really highlights the profound spiritual gravity of the moment. The Israelites thought they were just making a practical, administrative change to the government. But from the divine perspective, this was an act of total rejection. Following that, Samuel turns back to the people and delivers this blistering warning about what he calls the ways of the king. He flat out tells them that a human monarch is going to draft their sons into his armies and chariots, he's going to take their daughters to be his perfumers, cooks, and bakers, and he's going to confiscate their absolute best real estate, their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, just to hand them out to his political officials. And this brilliantly illustrates the incredibly heavy human and material sacrifices that are inherently required to build and maintain a centralized human government. That royal pageantry they wanted so badly, it definitely wasn't going to be free. In fact, Samuel gets extremely specific about the price tag, 10%. A human king, he warns, is going to take 1/10 of their grain and their flocks. And throwing that single number out there makes this ancient warning feel incredibly real and financially tangible, even to us today. The Israelites are being told in no uncertain terms that giving up their decentralized freedom for this new centralized security is going to hit them right where it hurts: their wallets, their farms, and their families.
So, do they listen to all these glaring red flags? Nope. Here is their response. No, but there shall be a king over us. Despite Samuel clearly laying out the astronomical costs, the drafting of their kids, the confiscation of their property, the heavy taxation on their livelihoods, the people flat out refuse to listen. It is a stubborn, entirely emotionally driven refusal to back down. The allure of being like the other nations is just way too strong for them to resist. And so, the historical sequence wraps up with this fateful decision being finalized. Step 1. God ultimately grants their request, basically letting them experience the full consequences of their own desires. And step 2. Saul is officially anointed as Israel's very first human king. The era of the judges is officially dead. The era of the monarchy has begun. The people got exactly what they asked for. Which leaves us with a really powerful question to ponder as we wrap up. Is the tangible security of human leadership actually worth the ultimate cost of freedom? This ancient text operates as the ultimate be careful what you wish for tale. The Israelites traded an invisible divine king for a visible human one, hoping for safety and conformity. But in doing so, they opened the door to taxation, conscription, and all the inevitable flaws of human power. It's a massive trade-off, and honestly, it's one that societies have been debating ever since.
King Saul's reign had already been severely plagued by disobedience to God and his own pretty severe mental instability. But his end? It comes during this completely disastrous battle against the Philistines. The Israelite army isn't just beaten, they are completely overwhelmed. It is an utter bloodbath. Saul's own sons are slaughtered in the fighting, and that includes, devastatingly, David's fiercely loyal friend, Jonathan.
So let's look at the fall of King Saul. The tragic psychology of his final moments is just fascinating. You see, Saul was already heavily consumed by jealousy, obsessively hunting down David, and to be fair, he correctly viewed David as a massive threat to his throne. But here, on the battlefield, he's severely wounded by enemy archers. Yet, his primary driving force isn't the physical pain. No, it's this intense, paralyzing fear of being captured, tortured, and humiliated by his enemies. He desperately orders his armor-bearer to kill him. And when the armor-bearer refuses out of sheer terror, which, makes sense, Saul makes the ultimate, tragic choice to fall on his own sword. There is a wild little side note in the sources here too. A later report by an Amalekite claims he actually delivered the final blow. But when he brought this news to David, expecting a big reward, David had the man executed right on the spot for daring to kill the Lord's anointed. Wow! But regardless of who actually struck that final blow, Saul's death leaves behind this massive, dangerously fractured power vacuum.
Now, regarding David's fractured rise, you might think David just casually walked into the capital and put the crown on his head the next morning, right? Not even close. His rise to power was a grueling, multi-year process. First off, after mourning Saul and Jonathan, David relocates to Hebron. There, the southern tribe of Judah immediately anoints him as their king, and he actually rules there for 7.5 years. Second, a bitter, drawn-out civil war erupts. Saul's general, a guy named Abner, sets up Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth, as a rival king over the northern tribes. So it's a standoff. But over time, David's forces grow stronger while Saul's house weakens. Finally, the third step happens, but only after Ishbosheth is assassinated by his own captains, and David bitterly condemned that treacherous act, by the way. But recognizing his military prowess and divine choosing, the northern elders finally come down to Hebron. David is anointed king of all Israel at the age of 30, and he fully consolidates ultimate power.
Looking at the triumphs of the Golden Age, with the Civil War finally behind him, David sparks an era that becomes the literal gold standard for every single future king. I mean, the sheer scale of his success here is staggering. First, he brilliantly captures the fortress of Zion from the Jebusites. Why? To create Jerusalem. It was a perfectly neutral capital city sitting right on the border between the northern and southern tribes. Genius move. Militarily, he goes on the offensive. He decisively crushes the Philistines and radically expands Israel's borders. We're talking conquering the Moabites, Syrians, Edomites, and Ammonites to establish a highly secure regional empire. On top of all that, he centralizes the spiritual devotion of the entire nation by bringing the sacred Ark of the Covenant directly into Jerusalem. Now, the source notes that God actually didn't allow David to build the permanent temple because he was a man of war, but he does receive the Davidic covenant. This was a profound divine promise that his royal lineage would endure forever, and that specific promise becomes the absolute foundation for all later messianic hopes.
The sword shall never depart from your house, a chilling quote from Nathan the prophet, because, sadly, the golden age does not last. The turning point of this entire history hinges on a truly catastrophic personal failure. David commits adultery with a woman named Bathsheba, and to cover up his actions, he engineers the cold-blooded murder of her husband, Uriah the Hittite, by intentionally abandoning him on the front lines of the battlefield. Now, David does genuinely repent when he is famously confronted by the prophet Nathan, but the consequences of this severe abuse of power, they're permanent. Nathan delivers that chilling, unyielding prophecy: the sword shall never depart from your house.
And we see that devastating family fallout almost immediately. The prophecy manifests and completely fractures his reign, creating a level of family dysfunction that honestly rivals any modern political thriller or prestige HBO drama. Year 1 marks the pivot point, the sin with Bathsheba and Uriah's orchestrated murder. Just months later, a horrifying tragedy occurs when David's son Amnon assaults his own half-sister, Tamar. 2 years pass, and Absalom, Tamar's full brother, murders Amnon in a highly calculated act of bloody revenge. And you guys, the dominoes just keep falling. In the later years of David's reign, this same son, Absalom, launches a massive, widespread rebellion against his own father. It's so successful that it forces King David to actually flee his own capital of Jerusalem in complete and utter humiliation.
So, Adonijah's failed coup. While David ultimately survives Absalom's rebellion and manages to regain his throne, the damage to his household is permanent. The situation inside the palace is getting urgent. David is incredibly old at this point. He's physically frail. The sources say he's reportedly unable to even keep warm in his bed. So, sensing the impending end and seeing his father's extreme weakness, David's eldest surviving son, Adonijah, spots a major opportunity. He attempts a swift, bold coup to seize the throne before the king officially passes away. He's basically setting himself up as the inevitable successor.
But Adonijah completely underestimates the remaining political operators in David's inner circle. Enter Solomon riding to Gihon. The prophet Nathan and Bathsheba immediately intervene. They go directly to David and remind him of a previous binding oath he made, that Bathsheba's son Solomon should be the one to succeed him. And David, even in his incredibly frail state, he acts with sudden, decisive swiftness. He orders this brilliantly public political maneuver. Solomon is placed on the royal mule, ridden down to Gihon, and publicly, loudly anointed as the true king. This rapid, highly visible action completely pulls the rug out from under Adonijah. It instantly crushes his attempted coup.
40. That's the exact number of years David ruled before his epic run finally comes to an end. He dies of natural causes at the age of 70. So that's 7 years ruling in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. But right before passing, he left Solomon with these incredibly strict dual deathbed charges. It's fascinating. On one hand, he commands Solomon to walk faithfully in the laws of God. Very pious. But on the other hand, he tells him to shrewdly and frankly ruthlessly deal with political enemies. He specifically names men like Joab and Shammai, guys who had undermined David's reign in the past. David is then buried in the city of David, leaving behind a massively powerful, wealthy kingdom for his son.
So we're left looking at the incredibly complex legacy of David. It's a dual legacy. On the one hand, the sources portray a deeply flawed man of war. I mean, he fought bloody civil wars. He abused his absolute power to orchestrate a murder just to cover up his own infidelity. And he was plagued by a completely devastating family dysfunction that very nearly tore his kingdom apart. Yet, on the other hand, the source text equally remembers him as a man after God's own heart. He successfully unified those fractured tribes into a regional powerhouse. He centralized spiritual devotion in Jerusalem, and he secured an eternal covenant that echoed throughout the rest of history.
Which leaves us with this final, massive question to ponder as we wrap up. Can true greatness be achieved without devastating personal compromise? As we've seen in the explainer today, the duality of leadership is just profound. The crown of ancient Israel absolutely forged an incredible golden age, but it came at a remarkably heavy, deeply human cost. What's really wild about this story is the sheer, dramatic tragedy of the math. Think about it. We're looking at a scenario where it took 40 solid years to build the ancient world's greatest empire. We're talking the ultimate superpower, built on unprecedented peace, global trade, and divine wisdom. And yet, it took literally 1 day for the whole shebang to be completely destroyed. It's crazy, right? How does an empire with zero major external enemies just completely implode from the inside out? Well, to understand the collapse, we first have to understand the peak.
Unlike his predecessors, Solomon actually didn't have to fight these bloody, endless wars to conquer his territory. He inherited a highly secure, completely unified kingdom from his father, David. The historical texts tell us that upon taking the throne, Solomon asked God, not for wealth, not for the death of his enemies, but for wisdom to govern his people justly. And he was granted that wisdom. But alongside it, he got immense wealth and a level of global prestige that was just practically unheard of in the ancient Near East. Culturally, the man was an absolute powerhouse. He's credited with writing 3,000 proverbs and composing over 1,000 songs. But, it wasn't all just poetry and philosophy. He backed it up with a heavily fortified military machine, 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. His reputation was so legendary that foreign rulers, like the famous Queen of Sheba, traveled vast distances across the ancient world, literally just to test his intellect with hard questions. And, as the story goes, she famously concluded that the reality of his kingdom far exceeded the rumors.
To truly grasp the economic magnitude of this era, you just need one number: 666. The historical records state that Solomon received an astonishing 666 talents of gold annually. To put that into perspective for you today, that's roughly 25 metric tons of pure gold pouring into Jerusalem every single year. It's mind-blowing. And incredibly, that was just in taxes and tribute. That doesn't even factor in his massive trade revenue. It got to the point where the texts note that silver was considered as common as ordinary stones in the streets of Jerusalem. Think about that for a second.
Supported by massive merchant fleets, which he built in partnership with King Hiram of Tyre to bring in exotic goods like ivory, apes, and peacocks, Solomon launched some of the most lavish building projects the ancient world had ever seen. His crowning achievement, hands down, was the first temple for God in Jerusalem. It took 7 years to build, using the absolute finest cedar from Lebanon, and was completely overlaid with gold on the inside. After that, he spent 13 years building a sprawling royal palace featuring an ivory throne covered in pure gold. And of course, to protect all of this, he heavily fortified strategic cities like Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer, completely transforming them into advanced military garrisons.
But here's the crucial point. There is a deeply hidden human cost to all these architectural marvels: the levy. Because, as you can imagine, maintaining a global superpower requires astronomical amounts of money and labor. Solomon actually conscripted tens of thousands of ordinary Israelites into forced labor. They were sent away from their homes in rotating shifts to cut timber in Lebanon and quarry massive stones. And on top of this forced labor, the empire's 12 administrative districts were taxed incredibly heavily to feed this massive royal court. It created a really deep-seated resentment that was just bubbling right beneath the surface. The fascinating thing about history is that the very tools of a leader's success are so often the exact instruments of their downfall. And for Solomon, it's a textbook case. His staggering wealth, his grand scale, his brilliant foreign diplomacy, they literally planted the seeds for his own empire's destruction. Because the collapse wasn't just political, it was deeply spiritual. Take the number 1,000. To secure political alliances and ensure peace with neighboring empires, Solomon practiced polygamy on a scale that is genuinely hard to even fathom. He took 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines. That brings the total to a staggering 1,000 women in his royal court. Now, these weren't just romantic pursuits, right? These were deeply calculated international treaties with nations like the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. The massive problem here? These were the exact nations with whom God had explicitly forbidden Israel to intermarry. And those foreign alliances led directly to spiritual apostasy. The historical texts report that as Solomon grew older, his foreign wives turned his heart toward their native gods. So to appease his wives and maintain these vital political alliances, the exact same king who had just dedicated the magnificent temple to God began building pagan shrines on the hills east of Jerusalem. He built shrines for Ashtaroth, Chemosh, and most disturbingly Molech, a deity historically associated with child sacrifice. The spiritual core of the empire was just rotting from the top down. Because of this blatant spiritual unfaithfulness, the texts state that a divine decree was issued. The kingdom would be torn away from Solomon's lineage. Out of respect for his father David, this fracture was delayed until after Solomon's death. But make no mistake, the stage was perfectly set for an explosive rebellion the very second his 40-year reign came to an end. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam took the throne. Immediately, representatives from the northern tribes, led by an exiled labor leader named Jeroboam, approached the new king. They had a really simple plea. They basically said,
Lighten the heavy yoke of forced labor and taxes your father put on us, and we will serve you happily. So Rehoboam faces two wildly distinct paths of leadership. On one side, his father's older, highly experienced counselors advised him to be a servant to the people and lighten their load. On the other side, his young, arrogant peers advised him to show absolute dominance, be brutal, and actually increase the people's burdens.
In what has to be one of the most colossal failures of leadership in recorded history, Rehoboam actually rejected the wisdom of his elders. Instead, he turned to his suffering, exhausted people and delivered this absolutely brutal ultimatum. He said, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." I mean, wow. He completely misread the room, choosing fear, arrogance, and intimidation over wisdom and service.
As you'd expect, the reaction from the people was immediate, and it was explosive. They didn't negotiate, they didn't cower. The northern tribes shouted this famous battle cry, "What portion do we have in David? To your tents, O Israel!" And just like that, in a single day, the fragile peace and unity that took 4 entire decades to build completely evaporated.
In 931 BC, the United Empire permanently collapsed into two rival nations. In the north, you have the Kingdom of Israel, which consisted of 10 tribes led by the labor leader Jeroboam. Now, to keep his new citizens from traveling south to worship down in Jerusalem, Jeroboam immediately plunged his nation into idolatry by setting up golden calves in Dan and Bethel. Meanwhile, in the south, the drastically reduced Kingdom of Judah consisted of just 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. They remained loyal to Rehoboam and the Davidic line in Jerusalem, but the damage was done. The golden era was instantly replaced by centuries of bitter civil war and deeply weakened borders.
When you look back at the timeline, you really see how this whole story builds and then just suddenly drops off a cliff. Year 1, Solomon receives his incredible divine gift of wisdom. Between years 4 and 24, we see 2 solid decades of unprecedented construction, wealth building, and the establishment of global dominance with the temple and the royal palace. But then, look at year 40. The moment the foundational leadership fails, passing to an arrogant successor, the entire structure violently fractures. Decades of progress just completely wiped out by a single disastrous policy decision, and, of course, years of underlying rot.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. Did Solomon's legendary wisdom ultimately fail him in his later years when he gave in to all that political and spiritual compromise? Or is it simply a law of human nature that absolute power, limitless wealth, and massive scale will eventually fracture every golden empire? It's a fascinating lens through which to view history, the timeless cost of greatness, and the real price of building a superpower.
One king's political panic, doom an entire nation to ruin. We're going to look at the biblical history of the sin of Jeroboam, basically through the lens of a high-stakes political thriller. Because what starts off as this desperate act of self-preservation quickly spirals into a deeply entrenched cultural trap, one that ultimately led to the complete destruction of the northern kingdom by the Assyrian Empire. To really grasp the sheer scale of Jeroboam's panic, we have to understand his stark geopolitical vulnerability. Sure, Jeroboam's northern kingdom had the raw numbers. He had 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. But his rival, Rehoboam, down in the southern kingdom of Judah, had something way more powerful. He had Jerusalem. And in the ancient world, Jerusalem wasn't just a city on a map. It was the cultural, the economic, and the spiritual heartbeat of the entire Hebrew faith. The Torah actually required all Israelite men to travel down to Jerusalem 3 times a year for major festivals. For Jeroboam, this is a massive security threat. Having your citizens constantly traveling into enemy territory to worship is basically a recipe for mass defection. If you look at his internal monologue recorded in 1 Kings, you see a man pushed absolutely to the brink. He thinks, if they offer sacrifices, they will kill me. He isn't just worried about losing some tax revenue here. He is terrified of being assassinated. He genuinely believes that if his people keep worshiping in Jerusalem, their hearts are going to return to the southern king, Rehoboam, and his own life will be forfeit. It's this pure, unadulterated political panic that drives his next spiritual compass literally points to your rival's capital. Well, you execute a totally desperate geopolitical strategy. Step 1, Jeroboam builds 2 brand new sanctuaries at the absolute geographical extremes of his kingdom. He puts one in Dan, way up in the north, and one in Bethel in the south, literally right on the border. It's brilliant in a dark way, right? If someone's heading south toward Jerusalem, they'd hit Bethel first and just think, you know what, good enough. Step 2, to replace the famous Ark of the Covenant, he installs a golden calf in each location. He pitches this whole thing to the public as just a matter of convenience. His PR spin is, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." But what is truly mind-boggling about this is that he uses the exact same phrase Aaron used at Mount Sinai centuries earlier. He's literally reusing the worst spiritual failure in Israelite history as his new marketing slogan. It's just a blatant, shocking disregard for the second commandment. What we are looking at here is a textbook case of syncretism. Historically speaking, Jeroboam wasn't necessarily trying to invent a brand new foreign god right out of the gate. He was probably telling the people, hey, God is invisibly enthroned above these calves, just like he is above the Ark of the Covenant down in Jerusalem. Because in the ancient Near East, gods were very commonly depicted standing on the backs of bulls. So Jeroboam was blending the worship of the true God with this highly popular but highly forbidden pagan imagery. Setting up a couple of shiny idols wasn't going to cut it. Jeroboam needed to create a completely parallel religious universe. When the actual Levite priests naturally refused to participate in this and fled south, Jeroboam didn't even flinch. He just appointed new priests from all sorts of people, completely tossing out the ancient strict lineage requirements. And to top the whole thing off, he invents his own religious festival, placing it exactly 1 month after the ordained Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem. It's an entire engineered system, an alternative artifact, an alternative priesthood, and an alternative calendar, all custom designed to keep everyone occupied and content right inside his borders. Here is the crazy part. This wasn't just some temporary political measure. It became a deeply entrenched cultural norm that lasted for 200 years. And over that 2-century span, 19 different kings rose to power in the north. Those 19 kings were spread across 9 different dynasties. We're talking constant political upheaval, bloody coups, and incredibly rapid turnover. And yet, amidst all that chaos, across 2 centuries, 19 kings, and 9 dynasties, guess how many kings removed the golden calves? 0. Literally not a single one. Just let that sink in for a second. That is the ultimate proof of how thoroughly this sin stuck to the culture. In the biblical books of Kings and Chronicles, the sin of Jeroboam becomes this haunting, repetitive refrain. It's almost like a spiritual report card. Every single northern king, whether they were just sort of passive rulers or absolute bloodthirsty tyrants, gets the exact same grade from the biblical historians. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, walking in the ways of Jeroboam and in his sin. It became an inescapable legacy. There's this fascinating anecdote that captures this perfectly. Decades later, a really fiery king named Jehu stages a brutal coup. He violently wipes out the detestable worship of the foreign god Baal from the land, and he earns high praise for his zeal in doing so. And yet, even Jehu wouldn't touch those calves. He destroyed Baal, but he left Jeroboam's entire counterfeit system completely intact. So why was it so impossible to get rid of? Well, it ultimately comes down to harsh political reality. Destroying those calves meant admitting to the citizens that Jerusalem, in the rival south, was actually the only true place of worship. To revert to Jerusalem worship risked absolute political suicide. Over the years, those golden calves had become the foundational myth of northern independence itself. No king dared undo the system because in their minds, political survival always trumped spiritual purity. Simply can't build a nation on a rotting foundation indefinitely. Jeroboam's clever political calculation turned out to be a massive spiritual death sentence. In 930 BC, he normalizes idolatry with the calves. Fast forward a bit to 870 BC, and King Ahab and Queen Jezebel are introducing incredibly deep, systemic corruption, even child sacrifice. The spiritual decay just accelerates until 722 BC, when the massive Assyrian Empire sweeps down, conquers the capital of Samaria, and drags the 10 tribes of Israel into a permanent exile, scattering them completely across the ancient world. The biblical historians pull absolutely no punches here. They leave no doubt as to the root cause of this catastrophic end. Their final verdict is incredibly sobering. Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam until the Lord removed them from his presence. That Assyrian exile, it was simply the physical result of a spiritual collapse that began 200 years earlier. Which leaves us with a really provocative question to think about. What happens when we trade long-term foundational integrity for short-term political survival? Jeroboam chose fear over faith, and in trying to secure his own life, he planted the seeds for his entire nation's ultimate ruin. It's a fascinating, deeply sobering piece of history that asks us to really examine what we build our own foundations upon today.
In the death of King Solomon, a once-united, powerful kingdom just rapidly descended into instability. It completely shattered into two pieces. The southern kingdom became Judah, and the north held on to the name Israel. Then, a king named Jeroboam I makes a massive, fateful move. He sets up these golden calves in Bethel and Dan specifically to prevent his people from traveling south to worship. And the source material shows how this single, calculated political move basically triggered a total spiritual collapse. It launched an era of assassinations, fractured dynasties that would literally last only a few years, and an endless, bloody civil war.
What is so fascinating here is the stark juxtaposition between Omri's undisputed geopolitical brilliance and the biblical sources' completely damning verdict on his legacy. I mean, Omri wasn't a priest or a prophet. He was a hardened warrior who finally ended the civil war. He built a brand new, heavily fortified capital city called Samaria up on a highly strategic hill. He was so successful that even the mighty Assyrian Empire officially recognized his dynasty's power. Yet, according to the text, all of this outward success masked a deep, deep internal rot. The text actually judges him as doing more evil than all the kings before him, which laid the groundwork for a massive national crisis.
Ahab inherited this incredibly wealthy, powerful kingdom, but he also made a fateful decision to marry a Phoenician princess named Jezebel. Now, politically, this alliance made total sense. Culturally, though, it was a catastrophe. She was the daughter of the king of Sidon, and let me tell you, she did not arrive quietly. She aggressively integrated her foreign religious practices directly into the heart of the kingdom. What had previously just been occasional, scattered idol worship was suddenly elevated into official, state-sponsored national policy.
So you might be wondering, who exactly was Jezebel bringing into Israel? Enter Baal, a chief deity for the Canaanites and Phoenicians. To grasp why this was so appealing to the people, we really have to put ourselves in the shoes of an ancient agricultural society. A deity believed to control the rain was seen as the absolute, ultimate source of wealth and survival. I mean, rain meant food, and food meant power. It's actually pretty easy to see how a frightened or maybe just greedy populace would be drawn to a god promising endless agricultural prosperity.
However, the source material explicitly details that this was not just, a different set of prayers. Baal worship was a horrific system of rituals that fundamentally opposed the nation's foundational covenant. We're talking extreme and violent practices here, from temple prostitution to occult ceremonies, self-mutilation, and in some regions, literally child sacrifice. The text makes it absolutely crystal clear. This wasn't some friendly cultural exchange. It was a direct, violent rebellion against the core identity of ancient Israel. This whole situation quickly built into an all-out religious war. On one hand, the state used its immense power and wealth to support hundreds of Baal's prophets directly from the royal table. They were living large. On the other hand, the grim reality for the prophets of Yahweh was brutal. They were being hunted down, executed, and the survivors were literally forced to hide in caves just to stay alive. The source describes this as one of the darkest spiritual periods in the region's history, a time of absolute fear and state-sponsored terror.
But right into this terrifying environment stepped a lone, rugged figure. Enter Elijah the Tishbite. He just emerges suddenly from the wilderness, no royal pedigree, absolutely no political army backing him up. Yet he walks right up to King Ahab and delivers a devastating prophecy. There would be no rain except by his word. This was brilliant because Elisha strategically targeted Baal's supposed domain over the weather. By declaring an absolute drought, he was directly challenging the god of rain right on his home turf. Days turned into years, rivers dried up, famine spread, and every single day exposed Baal's complete powerlessness.
Elijah calls the entire nation, along with the hundreds of prophets of Baal, to Mount Carmel. Standing before this massive crowd, he issues an incredible ultimatum. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. Elijah is demanding that the people finally get off the fence, choose an allegiance, and stop compromising their core identity. And the wildest part? The source text notes that the crowd initially responded with total silence. Nobody said a word.
So to break that awkward silence, Elijah brilliantly gamifies the confrontation. He sets clear, undeniable parameters to publicly prove which deity actually held power. The terms of engagement were super simple. Build 2 altars, prepare 2 sacrifices, but absolutely no fire provided by human hands. No matches, no flint. The rule was clear. The true God would answer by sending fire from heaven. It was the ultimate, inescapable public test.
And the source describes a dramatic and absolute victory.
On the Baal side, the prophets spend hours shouting, dancing, and violently cutting themselves with knives, practically begging for a response. The result? Absolute silence. Crickets. Then, Elijah steps up. He actually makes it way harder for himself by repeatedly soaking his altar in water until it's drenched. He spends just a moment offering a simple, brief prayer. And the result, according to the text? Fire literally falls from heaven, spectacularly consuming the sacrifice, the stones, and even evaporating the water in the trench. Baal is publicly, undeniably exposed as a total fraud.
The text outlines a horrific conspiracy that triggered the prophesied violent collapse of the entire dynasty. Ahab wanted a vineyard owned by an innocent man named Naboth. When Naboth refused to sell his ancestral land, Jezebel arranged for false witnesses to accuse him, having him executed just to steal his property. It was the ultimate abuse of power. From there, it all rapidly unravels. Ahab disguises himself in a war with Syria, but he's struck by a totally random arrow and bleeds to death in his chariot, with dogs licking his blood, exactly as Elijah prophesied. Later, a military commander named Jehu revolts. Jezebel, defiant to the very end with painted eyes, is thrown from a palace window by her own servants and trampled by horses. The dynasty is completely, brutally obliterated.
The narrative exposes the dangerous illusion of success. Think about it. The nation appeared externally incredibly strong, incredibly wealthy, and militarily dominant. But internally, they were experiencing a complete moral collapse because they had compromised their truth for political convenience. And the source reminds us that an idol doesn't just have to be some ancient stone statue of Baal. Idols can be literally anything: power, money, politics, or success that replaces our foundational core values. A society can project absolute outward strength while entirely rotting from the inside out.
Ultimately, the story of the House of Omri leaves us with this powerful, lingering question about our own allegiances today. Who truly rules the human heart? The text presents a gripping historical narrative, for sure, but it's really challenging us to take a hard look at our own lives. Are we wavering between two opinions in our own modern world? It's a deeply fascinating question to chew on, and it definitely leaves you wanting to explore more about the complex intersection of power, ethics, and truth throughout history.
Picture it for a second. Imagine standing completely alone against exactly 450 screaming opponents. That is the terrifying reality a single prophet named Elijah faced. Israel had entirely forgotten God. King Ahab and Queen Jezebel had actively dragged the nation into deep spiritual darkness, completely replacing the truth with the worship of idols. And standing against that entire corrupt establishment, against hundreds of angry, zealous prophets, was just one man, one single voice crying out for the truth. So this massive confrontation forces us to ask the exact same question Elijah used to challenge that nation wandering in darkness. When the people finally gathered before him, he looked right at them and asked, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." He was demanding that they finally pick a side. And shockingly, the crowd said absolutely nothing. Crickets. They were completely paralyzed. Okay, so there is a massive, painful irony here. For 3.5 years, not a single drop of rain had fallen on Israel. Rivers were bone dry, crops had completely failed, and animals were literally dying in the fields. But this drought wasn't just some random natural disaster. It was God's direct judgment. And why? Because the people had turned to this specific idol, Baal. Here's the kicker. Baal was the very false god that people believed controlled the rain and the storms. Talk about a backfire. They were starving and dying of thirst while worshiping the supposed god of rain, who was apparently completely powerless to help them. So God tells Elijah to go present himself to King Ahab, promising to finally send rain. Well, when Ahab sees Elijah, he is furious. He points right at the prophet and shouts, "So here is the man troubling Israel." But Elijah boldly flips the script. He fires right back, declaring, "I have not troubled Israel. You and your father's house have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed Baal." I love that. Elijah refuses to take the blame for the king's corrupt leadership, and instead, he issues a historic challenge. All of Israel, along with those 450 prophets of Baal, gather at Mount Carmel for an epic showdown to settle this debate once and for all. And the setup is fascinating. It's incredibly fair, but also impossible. 2 identical altars are prepared, wood is gathered, and sacrifices are placed on top. But here is the massive catch. No fire can be lit by human hands. Nobody gets a match. Elijah declares, "The God who answers by fire, he is the true God." The people agree. The test is officially on. Prophets of Baal proudly take the stage first, and honestly, what follows is a masterclass in escalating desperation. First, they start in the morning, just shouting to their God for hours, until noon. When absolutely nothing happens, they move to step 2, dancing wildly and frantically around the altar. All the while, Elijah is literally standing up to the side, coldly taunting them. He tells them to shout louder, saying maybe their God is thinking or traveling or just taking a nap. This pushes the prophets into absolute madness. They scream even louder and move to step 3, literally mutilating themselves with knives until their blood flows, hour after agonizing hour.
And this brings us to such a profound moment in the story. Despite the hundreds of screaming men, the frantic dancing, and the flowing blood, there is absolute deafening silence from the heavens. No voice, no fire, no response whatsoever. All of that human effort, all of that crazy energy and pain amounted to absolutely zero. Why? Because Baal simply wasn't real.
Evening rolls around, the pacing dramatically slows down, the frantic shouting finally stops. Elijah calls the quieted crowd to come closer to him, and notice this, he doesn't just build a new altar, he specifically rebuilds the broken altar of the Lord. He carefully selects exactly 12 stones, one representing each of the 12 tribes of Israel. He's visually reminding the people of who they truly are. Then he digs a deep trench all around the base of this restored altar.
Then, Elijah does something that honestly sounds crazy. Remember, they are in the middle of a devastating 3.5-year drought. Water is the single most precious resource on earth right now, and yet Elijah looks at the people and says, pour water on the altar. They drench the wood and the sacrifice. But he isn't finished. Do it again, he says, and then do it a third time. He completely floods the sacrifice, the wood, and the stones until water is literally overflowing the deep trench he just dug. He's doing this to ensure there can be absolutely no human explanation, no hidden spark, no sleight of hand. Only God could possibly answer now.
So think about the stark contrast here. We just watched the prophets of Baal spend hours screaming, bleeding, and wildly dancing. But Elijah? He simply steps forward with calm, genuine faith. No screaming, no frantic rituals. He just speaks this short, powerful prayer. O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Answer me, Lord, so these people will know that you alone are God.
Boom! Instantly, the silence is broken. Fire fell from heaven. And we're not talking about a little spark to light the wood. It was a roaring, all-consuming inferno from the sky. The flames instantly vaporized the sacrifice. They incinerated the wood, they burned up the 12 stones, they scorched the very dust of the ground. And they completely swallowed up every single drop of water overflowing in that flooded trench. Literally nothing was left.
You could imagine the thousands of Israelites in attendance, the same people who had been silently wavering just hours before. The entire mountain shakes, and they instantly fall flat on their faces in sheer awe. They cry out in unison, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." In one breathtaking moment, God had undeniably revealed His power and completely won back the hearts of the nation. The battle decisively won, the physical salvation of the land can finally begin. Elijah climbs to the top of Mount Carmel to pray for rain. At first, the sky remains completely empty, but he just keeps praying. Finally, his servant spots it. A tiny cloud appears on the horizon, no bigger than a man's hand. But hey, that's all it takes. Soon, the heavens grow dark, thunder roars across the sky, and heavy, life-giving rain finally pours over the restored nation of Israel. After years of devastation, God had answered.
Really distill this epic story down to 4 incredible truths. Number 1, individual courage matters. One faithful person truly can stand against immense darkness, just like Elijah did against those 450 prophets. Number 2, worldly idols, whether that's ancient Baal or our modern obsessions like power, money, and fame, are totally hollow and will always fail us when we need them most. Number 3, simple, genuine faith is vastly stronger than chaotic, empty rituals. Elijah's short prayer moved heaven, while hours of frantic screaming did absolutely nothing. And finally, number 4, true restoration, true revival, always begins when people turn their hearts back to the truth. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought to challenge your own journey. Remember Elijah's initial challenge. If the Lord is God, follow him. Now let's dive right into this central paradox. The story of King Jehu is famous because he executed a brilliant, divinely mandated purge that completely wiped out a notorious royal dynasty. But despite all that unmatched religious zeal, his reformation just stopped dead in its tracks. Why does a zealous revolutionary stop halfway?
We're looking at how a leader can be completely uncompromising one moment, only to deliberately sabotage his own legacy the very next. Decades earlier, King Ahab marries the Phoenician princess Jezebel. And Jezebel didn't just want a polite, pluralistic society where she could tolerate her own gods alongside Israel's. She aggressively sought to replace the traditional worship of Yahweh entirely with the imported worship of Baal, the Canaanite storm and fertility god. This wasn't just religious tolerance. This was a hostile, cultural, and spiritual takeover from the top down. Jezebel builds a massive temple to Baal right in the capital city of Samaria. She actively slaughters the prophets of Yahweh, and she institutionalizes this new paganism. By the time our main character enters the picture, the nation is rotting from the highest levels of government on down. His chariot like an absolute madman, Jehu executes his mission with terrifying efficiency. He works his way through a 3-step checklist. First, he assassinates Joram, the king of Israel, and Ahaziah, the king of Judah, who just happened to be visiting. Second, he rides right up to Jezebel's stronghold and has her thrown out of a high window to her death. And third, he orchestrates the execution of Ahab's 70 remaining descendants. High-profile targets checked off with bloody precision. He needed to get all the Baal worshippers into one place. So he pretends to be a pagan convert. He famously declares, "Ahab served Baal a little, Jehu will serve him much." Using this brilliant piece of propaganda, he lures the public into a mandatory, nationwide solemn assembly for Baal. The setup for this trap is meticulously chilling. He packs every single priest, prophet, and worshiper into the temple in Samaria until it is literally wall to wall. He carefully checks to ensure absolutely zero worshippers of Yahweh are inside, and right outside the doors, he stations 80 armed guards. This second the pagan sacrifices begin, the trap springs. At his signal, the 80 guards move in, executing a total, uncompromising massacre. Every single person inside is killed. And this next detail brilliantly illustrates his utter contempt for the foreign religion. They smash the sacred stone, completely tear down the temple, and deliberately turn the site into a public latrine. Yeah, he literally made it a public toilet to guarantee it could never ever be used for worship again. The biblical text actually praises Jehu for this specific total victory over Baal. Crucial point here is that Jehu stops exactly halfway. He tears down Baal's temple, but he deliberately leaves the golden calves of Jeroboam completely untouched. The state-sponsored shrines at Dan and Bethel stay standing. Proved without a doubt that he was willing to kill for his divine mandate, but he wasn't willing to completely trust that mandate with his political future. The golden calves were an entirely different beast than Baal. They represented state-sponsored syncretism. When you compare the two, Jehu's choice makes perfect, cold-blooded sense. Baal worship was a foreign import that handed cultural control to outsiders, an obvious, direct threat to Jehu. But the golden calves, they were a domestically created, corrupted representation of Yahweh that crucially maintained Israel's political independence from the neighboring kingdom of Judah. Because if Jehu destroyed the golden calves at Dan and Bethel, he would have had to tell his citizens that the only legitimate place to worship was at the temple in Jerusalem. But Jerusalem was the capital city of the rival southern kingdom of Judah. If his citizens are regularly traveling south to Jerusalem, Jehu figures their allegiance is going to inevitably shift back to the rival line of David, leaving his own newly seized throne completely vulnerable. So he keeps them. The golden calves were the ultimate political safety net for his throne. Jehu was a brilliant, calculated opportunist who used religious zeal to legitimize his violent coup, but he stopped the exact moment obedience threatened his own survival. Well, because he did eradicate Baal, Jehu was rewarded. God promised that his descendants would sit on the throne for 4 generations. In the turbulent history of the Northern Kingdom, this actually became the longest-lasting single dynasty they would ever see. But it was a tragic success, because his heart wasn't fully in it, and because he tolerated the calves for political expediency, his reformation was ultimately hollow. The sin of Jeroboam remained the institutionalized national religion. The spiritual trajectory of the Northern Kingdom remained totally unchanged, drifting steadily toward its eventual, total destruction.
How does a chosen nation just collapse? I mean, really think about this for a second. How does a group of people who were rescued from slavery, led through absolute miracles, given direct covenants and divine promises, how do they end up conquered, exiled, and literally erased from history? It's a terrifying question, right? But the answers we find in this autopsy are deeply profound.
doctor can give you a diagnosis, they've got to look at the symptoms, right? And the main symptom here is the absolute destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by the mighty Assyrian Empire. But studying the history, you quickly realize this collapse wasn't just some overnight accident. For over 200 years, the northern kingdom had been slowly drifting. King after king repeated the exact same mistakes, and dynasties violently replaced one another. But finally, around 722 BC, the bill came due. The Assyrian Empire, which, by the way, was arguably the most terrifying and ruthless military force in the ancient Near East at that time, invaded. They wiped the kingdom off the map, deported the population, and replaced them with foreigners. The nation just vanished.
And let me tell you, it was not a quick or merciful end. I really want to highlight this number 3. The capital city, Samaria, endured a grueling, brutal siege for 3 agonizing years. Just imagine the fear, the starvation, and the sheer desperation over 3 whole years before the city finally broke and the people were dragged away. That is the historical reality. What's really fascinating here is that after recounting that horrific fall, the biblical writer actually pauses the historical narrative. He just stops talking about armies and sieges, and he gives us this devastating spiritual diagnosis by focusing on one specific phrase: this occurred because. He completely bypasses the military weakness. He doesn't say, oh, Assyria had better chariots, or they had stronger iron weapons. He doesn't blame bad political alliances or a weak economy. No, he blames the collapse directly and entirely on spiritual rebellion against God. He's literally presenting history through the lens of theology. This dynamic perfectly captures the central message of the entire text. On the one hand, we have political collapse, but remember, that was merely the visible symptom. On the other hand, we have the real disease, spiritual corruption. The physical destruction was just the outward manifestation of an internal rot that had been quietly growing for centuries.
So, the autopsy begins by pointing out a tragic case of amnesia. Think about the massive events in their past. This was the exact same God who parted the Red Sea, who defeated Pharaoh, who fed them in a barren wilderness and gave them a sacred covenant. And yet, the very people he rescued completely forgot him. It proves a really powerful point. When a people forget the God who delivered them, they don't just end up believing in nothing. No, they actively seek out substitutes.
Before we even touch on the history, the timeline, or the whole societal collapse of the ancient world, we have to ask a foundational question. What actually happens when a people betray the very one who rescued them? Like, what does God feel when people abandon him? Because we aren't just talking about, simple disobedience or breaking a few arbitrary rules here. We're talking about total, complete betrayal. And the text we're analyzing today gives us a really unique window into this exact scenario, showing us a divine reaction that is way more emotional than we might typically expect.
Okay, so picture this. The source material kicks off with this incredibly jarring, counterintuitive premise. We see God actually commanding his prophet Hosea to marry a woman named Gomer. Now, look, ancient prophets were often asked to do some pretty strange performance art to get a point across. But this was extreme even for them. Because God tells Hosea right out of the gate that this marriage is not going to be a peaceful love story. He knows Gomer is going to be unfaithful. He knows she's going to run after other lovers and completely shatter Hosea's heart.
Which naturally raises a massive question. Why on earth would God ask his prophet to experience such profound intentional pain? It sets up this incredible narrative tension right from the jump. I mean, why willingly walk into personal heartbreak? As readers, we're just left wondering what possible purpose could be served by forcing a prophet to endure this kind of agonizing domestic betrayal.
Well, the text draws a brilliant parallel to answer that, directly linking the micro to the macro. On one side, you have Hosea and Gomer, right? A betrayed husband and an unfaithful wife. But on the other side, you have God and ancient Israel, a faithful God and a nation that is just constantly chasing after idols. So, Hosea's broken marriage wasn't just some personal tragedy. It was a living, breathing, visible mirror for God's relationship with Israel. Hosea wasn't just supposed to preach God's message, he was called to actually physically feel it.
So let's zoom out a bit and see how this plays out on a societal level. The text describes Israel committing what it calls spiritual adultery. In real, practical terms, this meant they were chasing idols and trusting pagan nations instead of God. And the irony here is just tragic. They actually believed the local Canaanite idol, Baal, who was a god of storms, controlled the rain and fertility. So they were completely misattributing the very blessings God had provided them, giving all the credit to a false deity. It's that classic, devastating failure, getting incredible gifts from one source, but thanking something entirely made up for the grain, the wine, and the oil.
And what's truly fascinating about this is how it completely redefines a major concept for us. In Hosea, sin isn't just this clinical, detached rebellion against authority. It's not a parking ticket. It's not just crossing a line. It's defined as the profound betrayal of love and relationship. By framing their covenant as a marriage, the text shows us a God who reacts like a deeply wounded husband. It is so personal, so relational, and just deeply, deeply painful.
And you know, actions have consequences. As the pace of the nation's spiritual decay quickened, their entire society started collapsing from the inside out. I mean, the fallout was devastating. Widespread violence, lying, murder, deep political corruption, sexual immorality, dishonest leadership, it all just became the norm. Now, outwardly, the nation might have looked totally fine and prosperous for a little while, but beneath the surface, it was rotting. They experienced a complete loss of moral direction purely because they had abandoned their foundational relationship.
Which brings us to this strikingly profound quote from the text, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." Now, it's absolutely vital to understand what Hosea means by knowledge here. The Israelites hadn't just forgotten God intellectually, like, forgetting a historical fact for a pop quiz. They had forgotten him relationally. They no longer truly knew him. And when a society loses that ultimate moral and spiritual center, total destruction and confusion are basically inevitable.
So what did the people do when things started falling apart? Well, instead of looking back to their spiritual foundation, they looked horizontally for solutions. They scrambled for false security. They started placing all their trust in military strength, political alliances with foreign nations like Egypt and Assyria, and chasing economic prosperity. They were basically trying to fix this massive, deep-rooted spiritual problem with earthly political bandages, totally ignoring the actual condition of their soul.
But God cuts right through all that. As we transition into the emotional core of the text, he makes it very clear that none of those horizontal fixes, or even their empty religious rituals, are going to work. The text says, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings." See, the people were still putting on the religious performances. They were doing the festivals, the rituals, the whole shebang, but their hearts were a million miles away. The core message here is that empty religious performance means absolutely nothing without genuine, transformational faithfulness and love. Now, right about here, the pacing of the narrative slows down dramatically. The text shifts from the, justified anger of a betrayed husband and moves into the tender, sorrowful memories of a loving parent. We are getting a rare glimpse into the heart of a grieving father. This is where the text becomes incredibly vulnerable. It shows us a deity who is actually mourning over the destruction his children are bringing on themselves. Just listen to how stunningly vulnerable the language is in this section. "When Israel was a child, I loved him. I taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms." These are definitely not the cold, calculated words of some distant deity in the sky, right? They're the intimate, visceral memories of a father who carried, protected, and provided for his people throughout their history. It's this beautiful imagery of a parent guiding a toddler, remembering those early days of closeness, even while watching that child grow up and drift away.
And this leads us straight to the breathtaking emotional climax of the source material. God cries out, "How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel?" You can literally hear the anguish in those words. It reveals a divine heart that is just utterly torn by grief and love. Yes, the people absolutely deserve the consequences of their actions, but the Father simply cannot bear the thought of letting them go.
So the crucial point is captured perfectly in this tension. On one side, we have divine justice. The reality is that continuous, stubborn rebellion demands consequences and discipline. God is perfectly just. But on the other side, we have divine compassion, this loving heart that continuously reaches outward to restore, a heart that absolutely aches for reconciliation. This incredible, heavy tension between holiness and mercy is the driving engine behind the entire book of Hosea.
Ultimately, though, the consequences couldn't be put off forever. Historically, this unfolded in a few distinct eras. We move from generations of spiritual adultery into years of desperate prophetic warnings by Hosea, and tragically, into the day the Assyrian Empire actually invaded. Israel's cities fell, the people were exiled, and the kingdom completely collapsed. Literally everything Hosea warned them about became historical reality. But, and this is a huge but, remarkably, judgment was not the end of this timeline.
Looking way past the devastation of the exile, God promises ultimate restoration. The text declares, "I will heal their waywardness and love them freely." This is just an extraordinary pivot. The final word in this story isn't abandonment, and it certainly isn't destruction.
The final word is restoration. It proves that even after the absolute deepest betrayal and the harshest discipline, divine mercy is designed to triumph in the end.
So, let's distill the macro themes from all the source material we've covered today. The deeper message of Hosea is crystal clear. God is absolutely not an emotionally distant force. We learn that divine love inherently includes grief over human self-destruction. We see that judgment is never, ever separated from compassion. And most importantly, we learn that this divine love simply refuses to disappear. God warns, He disciplines, He mourns, but He relentlessly pursues His people.
Which leads us to the overarching takeaway from the book of Hosea. If you remember only one thing from this entire explainer, let it be this. God's love is relentless, persistent, and entirely unwilling to let go. Even when humanity repeatedly turns its back, runs away, and chases all kinds of false security, that love continues reaching outward. It is a love that survives even the ultimate betrayal.
But to really understand the triumph at the end of this story, we have to start with a devastating tragedy. Take a look at this number, 10. Out of the 12 ancient tribes of Israel, 10 of them simply vanished off the map. Just gone. They were completely erased from the geopolitical landscape in the year 722 BC. To really grasp the gravity of this vanished kingdom, let's map out this massive time gap. Picture the brutal Assyrian Empire just sweeping through the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, this wasn't just a simple change in leadership, right? It was an absolute uprooting. Imagine the dust kicking up as soldiers marched through, literally dragging families away in chains, forcibly scattering them across the ancient world. Starting right here at 722 BC, the northern kingdom was just utterly wiped out. And then we have this massive, gaping void of time. Centuries and centuries pass. And what happens to that once vibrant northern territory during this huge gap? Well, it remains absolutely barren. It becomes this spiritually dark territory, slowly repopulated by foreigners and outcasts over hundreds of years. So by the time we hit the 1st century AD, exactly when Jesus is stepping onto the scene to begin his public ministry, that northern land has a deeply entrenched, terrible reputation. I mean, it has been sitting in the dark for over 700 years. Geographically speaking, the specific area we're focusing on covers the ancient tribal lands of Zebulun and Naphtali. These were once incredibly proud names, vital parts of a unified nation. But after the Assyrian exile, this exact geography became a spiritually barren territory. It wasn't just economically deprived, though it was. It carried a really heavy theological stigma. It was widely known and pretty much universally accepted as a place that had just been utterly abandoned. And this brilliantly illustrates how that history built into a massive cultural stigma. The elites down in the south, they didn't even refer to it as Israel anymore. They actually slapped a brand new label on it, Galilee of the Gentiles. That was the 1st century name for this cursed northern region. To the Orthodox religious leaders sitting comfortably down south, this area was nothing but a cultural wasteland. Calling it Galilee of the Gentiles was essentially their way of saying, that place up there, it belongs to the outsiders now. It's compromised. It's totally lost. You can really see this stark divide when we put the two regions side by side. On one side, you've got Jerusalem. This is the seat of power, right? The royal courts, the religious epicenter, the absolute expected birthplace of any legitimate God-ordained movement. On the flip side, you have Galilee. Dusty fishing villages, a complete cultural wasteland, spiritually abandoned. If you were a betting person in the 1st century trying to predict exactly where the ultimate redemption story would begin, you'd put all your chips on Jerusalem for sure. You wouldn't even cast a second glance at Galilee. In fact, the absolute disdain the Jerusalem elites had for this northern region is perfectly captured right here. Look into it, and you will find that a prophet does not rise out of Galilee. I mean, that is some intense regional prejudice. They're essentially saying, go ahead, check the records. Nothing good, nothing holy, and definitely nothing prophetic ever comes out of that dark, dusty wasteland up north. So why start a movement in the dark? If that's the reputation, if it's considered an abandoned wasteland totally mocked by the intellectual elite, why on earth would you start there? This is where the historical narrative gets so fascinating. When Jesus actually launches his public ministry, he completely ignores the conventional playbook. No, really, he entirely bypasses the royal courts of Jerusalem. He doesn't set up his headquarters in the religious epicenter where all the elites are waiting for a king. Instead, he walks straight into the territory of the lost tribes. He heads straight to a dusty town called Capernaum. As we look at the details of his ministry in the wasteland, which is recorded over in the Gospel of Matthew, his geographic choices are incredibly deliberate. He makes his home in the fishing village of Capernaum. He walks right back into the ancient, supposedly cursed land of Zebulun and Naphtali. And right there, in the dust and the heat, right among the outcasts, he heals the sick and preaches to these massive crowds. He is bringing vibrant, undeniable life back to this exact abandoned geography. The gospel writers make it crystal clear that this geographical choice wasn't just some random coincidence. It was a masterfully calculated move. By stepping into Zebulun and Naphtali, Jesus was actually triggering a 700-year-old prophecy spoken by Isaiah. Just read this with me. The people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. Just think about the massive historical payoff here. Isaiah spoke those exact words as the Assyrian darkness was falling, wiping out the northern kingdom. And 7 centuries later, Jesus brings the light back to the exact place where the darkness began. By healing the sick and preaching the kingdom right there in Galilee, Jesus was making a profound, earth-shattering declaration to the world. The exile is over. Our source material beautifully points out that the Father, who promised through the prophet Hosea that he would absolutely never let go of his wayward children, had finally come back north to look for them. He didn't forget them. He just waited for the perfect moment to walk back into the wasteland and turn the lights back on. It really is an incredible narrative of reclaiming what was lost. Jesus began his mission to save the world by shining the light first on the very places everyone else had given up on, which leaves us with a pretty compelling thought to wrap up our explainer today. If the greatest movement in history started in an abandoned, mocked cultural wasteland, what places have been given up on today? Where is the Galilee in our modern world that might just be the staging ground for the next great light? Keep that in mind next time you look at a map or look at a community that others have just written off. The source text zones in on exactly 19 kings who ruled this northern kingdom. Over a span of roughly 200 years, this throne was a revolving door of absolute chaos. We're talking fierce warriors, cunning politicians, and honestly, a pretty shocking number of straight-up assassins. But here is the absolute kicker. Out of all 19 kings, the historical record makes this staggering claim: not a single one of them fully followed God. 0. Every last one of these guys chased power, ruled through fear, and opted for partial obedience. And step by step, they dragged an entire nation right over the edge. How this all started, we've got to look at the nation's very first king after the big split, a guy named Jeroboam. Right out of the gate, Jeroboam is just consumed by fear. He's terrified his people will travel down to Jerusalem to worship and end up turning on him. So instead of trusting the promises he was given, he basically invents a counterfeit religion. He sets up golden calves in Bethel and Dan, creates his own priesthood, and makes up new festivals. It's the textbook definition of partial obedience. He didn't flat out reject God, he just twisted the rules to protect his own seat of power. And man, did that set a deadly precedent.
Little fracture? Yeah, it didn't stay small. It spread like wildfire into this incredibly dark era where royal succession was, well, a bloodbath. Guys were taking the throne purely through violence. Baasha assassinates Nadab. Zimri murders Elah. Omri claws his way up through a brutal civil war. Jehu literally wipes out an entire royal bloodline. The throne is just soaked in blood. Why? Because power without God eventually devolves into pure, unadulterated corruption. They thought military might would make them safe, but the tighter they gripped, the faster the kingdom fell apart.
Now, out of all 19 rulers, one name really jumps off the page for all the wrong reasons: King Ahab. The text basically says Ahab took evil to a whole new level. He marries Jezebel, a princess completely devoted to Baal worship, and suddenly pagan altars are popping up everywhere, and God's prophets are literally being hunted down.
But Ahab, and even later guys like Jehu, who wiped out Baal, but actually kept Jeroboam's golden calves, they were so dangerous because of this sneaky cycle of compromise. They wanted all the blessings, but absolutely none of the surrender. It's like, I'll obey God, but only when it suits my political agenda. They'd cut out one sin, but fiercely protect another, looking righteous on the outside while living in total rebellion. It's a terrifying kind of self-deception. And fear is the engine driving the whole thing. Just look at the breakdown. Jeroboam is terrified of losing his kingdom, so he builds idols. Ahab is more scared of his political enemies than God, so he makes an unholy alliance and marries Jezebel. Later on, King Hosea is staring down an Assyrian invasion, and instead of trusting God, he compromises by turning to Egypt. The common thread here? Fear makes leaders stop asking what's the right thing to do and start asking what's going to protect me right now. And when self-preservation takes the wheel, disaster is guaranteed.
Now, despite this massive spiritual decay, God doesn't just walk away. He actually sends in the heavy hitters to confront these kings and call out their corrupt systems. You've got Elijah famously going toe-to-toe with Ahab. You have Elisha speaking truth to power across nations. Amos is out there crying foul on systemic injustice. And Hosea is just desperately pleading with the nation to turn around. Real powerful voices of intervention.
Their message was incredibly urgent, basically screaming, "Turn back to God before the judgment hits." But the kings? They largely just plugged their ears. You know why? Because truth is incredibly uncomfortable when you're addicted to power. These prophets were a direct threat to the cushy, corrupt lives the kings had built. So instead of humbling themselves, they just tried to silence the messengers. After nearly 200 years of all this political maneuvering and constant compromise, the bill finally comes due. And it wasn't a sudden surprise. It was a generational domino effect. Decades earlier, the kingdom splits, generations grow up under Jeroboam's golden calves, later Ahab hits the accelerator on the decay, and finally, in 722 BC, it all crashes down. Assyria invades, the cities are taken, families are violently deported, and the northern kingdom is literally wiped off the map forever. Because one leader after another chose their own skin over surrender, the whole nation paid the ultimate price. Now, we absolutely have to recognize that this isn't just dusty ancient history. It is a massive neon warning sign for human nature today. The takeaway here is that power without humility is incredibly dangerous. Fear absolutely destroys wisdom, and compromise chips away at the truth. This story proves that half-hearted obedience just slowly hardens your heart until, eventually, everything collapses.
All this, the source text gives us a beautiful spiritual antidote to that toxic cycle. We get two totally different models of kingship. On one side, you have Israel's 19 kings, driven by fear, obsessed with themselves, practicing partial obedience, and desperately clinging to control. But on the other side, the text presents Jesus as the ultimate contrast, a king defined by humility, who came purely to serve, living in complete surrender and obeying all the way to death. Where the 19 kings failed by trying to protect themselves, Christ actually succeeded by sacrificing himself.
So wrapping up this explainer, 19 kings, 19 blown opportunities. Their kingdom is gone, but their legacy is a massive wake-up call. The biggest danger out there isn't necessarily some loud, defiant rebellion. It's partial obedience. Because at the end of the day, partial obedience is still disobedience. It's that slow fade that quietly pulls your heart away from what's true.
Thanks for watching.
Stay blessed and don't forget to share this video with everyone.